A week after South Korea President Yoon Suk-yeol declares and then lifts martial law, calls continue for him to resign. What does this mean for the U.S. and the new Cold War on China? We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, a new show produced in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee. This is my co-host, KJ Noh. KJ, why don't you get us started with this week's headlines?
Chinese scientists invent effective, scalable method of removing microplastics from water. Chinese researchers at Wuhan University have invented a fibrous biomass foam that can soak up to 99.9% of microplastics, according to the journal Science Advances. The sponge, made from processed cellulose and chitin, can absorb 99.9% of microplastics in water. This could be a transformational approach to removing microplastic pollution in water across the globe, which is rapidly becoming one of the world's worst public health crises. Microplastic pollution involves thousands of plastic-related chemicals, which can then be absorbed into the brain, organs, breast milk, and growing fetal tissue. This has been linked to cancer, brain toxicity, hormone disruption, and developmental impairment, as well as heart attack and stroke. Individuals with microplastics in heart tissue are twice as likely to have a stroke or a heart attack.
The Chinese government has rolled out a 24-hour emergency response system for elders in Shanghai. In addition to managing emergencies such as injuries, falls, and burns, the system also provides daily living assistance, including personal care and people to accompany seniors to medical appointments when needed. This response system is part of a growing trend of the Chinese government allocating more resources to support elderly care. Liaoning province, for example, spent an equivalent of over $4 million both last year and this year to assist elderly individuals with home renovations. These renovations include bathroom safety features, as well as indoor mobility features, smart monitoring, and support equipment. By the end of last year, 27,000 homes of elderly people in the province had been remodeled, with an additional 15,000 households expected to be upgraded by the end of this year. In Longcheng, nearly 400 elevators have been installed for over 30,000 elderly living on the upper floors of apartment buildings so that they no longer need to struggle to go up and down stairs. There are an estimated 297 million people aged 60 or above in China, accounting for 21% of its total population. Most of them prefer to grow old at home, according to a recent poll.
Chinese mathematician says Chinese scholars have to leave the U.S. Chinese-American mathematician Yao Xingtung, formerly at Harvard, now at Tsinghua University, says that ethnic Chinese scientists have no choice but to leave the United States due to discrimination. Many ethnic Chinese students and researchers have left or have been driven away on false accusations and abuse. U.S. prowess in science and technology has been driven by waves of highly educated immigrants, including Hungarians, Eastern Europeans, Chinese, and other Asians. By persecuting these scholars and researchers, the U.S. is facilitating a reverse brain drain.
Last week, UNESCO officially declared the inclusion of Chinese New Year in its representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. This officially recognizes the cultural significance of Chinese New Year, a celebration that has been passed down through generations and is deeply rooted in Chinese traditions. It also strengthens efforts to protect and preserve this vital cultural practice. Chinese New Year, otherwise known as Spring Festival, is one of the most important traditional festivals in China with a history spanning thousands of years. During the holiday, people visit their families, prepare special festive meals, worship their ancestors, and set off fireworks, among other celebrations. Lion and dragon dances also are an important part of festivities. Last week, South Korea President Yoon declared martial law. The decree was struck down by National Assembly vote within a matter of hours, but the political crisis is not over, as Yoon faces a massive people's movement calling for him to resign. South Korea, and Yoon in particular, is key to the US's so-called Indo-Pacific strategy to contain China. What do these recent events spell for the new Cold War? To discuss this, we are honored to be joined by Tim Shorrock. Tim is a journalist and writer based in Washington, D.C., who grew up in Japan and South Korea during the Cold War. During the 1980s, Tim reported extensively on the Japanese and Korean labor and peace movements and broke important stories about the interventionist role of the U.S. military and the CIA in both countries. In 2015, he was given an honorary citizenship by the city of Gwangju for his reporting on the secret background role played by the U.S. government and military in the 1980 Democratic Uprising. He's the author of Spies for Hire, and his byline has appeared in many publications in the U.S., Japan, and Korea. And his work can be found at timshorrock.com. Tim, welcome to the China Report.
Thank you so much.
Well, Tim, you wrote a recent piece for Dropsite News analyzing this situation. Let's just quickly go over the events of the last week. Last Tuesday, Yoon Suk-yeol, without warning, or giving notice to members of his own party, declared martial law. He ordered the military surround the National Assembly building to prevent a vote to overturn the decree. Members of the National Assembly broke through the barricades, and they managed to get into the Parliament building to vote down the martial law order. And this martial law order was lifted within hours of its declaration. An impeachment vote was taken a few days later. It failed to get sufficient majority to pass, in large part because members of Yoon's own party boycotted the measure. Since then, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which is comprised over 1 million workers, they've called for an indefinite general strike until Yoon is removed from power. And that's all to say that Yoon is massively unpopular. He's faced over 20 impeachment attempts since he assumed office. And protests have seen large numbers of people across the country demanding his resignation. But I think the question in a lot of people's minds is, what was Yoon thinking when he was issuing this martial law order?
Well, it's really hard to figure that out because he is kind of a lunatic in some ways. I mean, this was such an extreme measure to try to arrest members of his own ruling party, and what exactly he was thinking. But I guess he felt that his power was under such, was so precarious that he had to do something extreme. And there are reports that one of the defense ministers had attempted to try to start some kind of conflict on the border with North Korea by sending drones over Pyongyang and getting a North Korean response so they could have a national emergency as a reason to declare martial law. But he just declared this, and I think it was so outrageous that's why it was quickly rescinded. And it's just these amazing scenes of lawmakers climbing over the fence to get into the National Assembly, and citizens helping them, and citizens mobilizing within minutes to stop this. And so it's really unclear to me exactly why he did this, but the situation is not over by any means. And his party, as you said, the People's PPP party that's been ruling under his regime, boycotted the National Assembly, so there couldn't be any kind of quorum to vote to impeach him. And so, they're saying that they're going to kind of take over from Yoon in some kind of way that's clearly unconstitutional by their constitution, and that they're still telling the U.S. that he is in control of the military and in control of the country. And it seems really odd that they would be saying this. But I think that if whatever they're saying to the U.S., I think it's to assure them that their party will remain in office no matter what, because the U.S. Has historically supported the most right wing elements in South Korea, and really disparaged and tried to weaken any kind of progressive or left presidents in the past, such as Kim Dae Jung, who was elected in 1997, who was a long time opposition leader, and then he was followed by Noh Moo-hyun, who came out of that tradition, and he opened up talks with North Korea, and for the first time ever. But then more conservative governments came in, and the last president was Moon Jae-in, who was also a progressive who had taken part in the 1970s and 1980s democracy movement, as a labor lawyer, and he of course reopened the Kim Dae Jung sunshine policy toward North Korea, and almost reached some very important agreements with the North that encouraged President Trump at that time to talk with Kim Jong Un in North Korea, but both directly negotiating with Trump, with Kim Jong Un, for Trump was very unpopular with the U.S. establishment, the Washington establishment, as well as the Democrats. And so the Democrats, Biden and Kamala Harris, have consistently attacked uh, uh, Trump for supposedly giving legitimacy to Kim Jong Un by simply negotiating with him, and that's an indirect critique of Moon Jae-in for doing the same thing. So it's really a curious situation. We can get into it later, but the important thing to know is that the U.S. and Korea are bound in they have a joint command, joint combined forces command, that's 600,000 soldiers strong, including 25,500 U.S. troops, and that all that command is under the command of a U.S. general in times of war. And so, pretty much any movement of South Korean forces must be not necessarily approved, but must be made. The U.S. officials, U.S. generals in Korea must be made aware of any major movement. So that's why I suspect that the U.S., despite their denials, probably was given some kind of advance warning of this, but I have no solid proof of that. But that's my suspicion based on what's happened before.
Yeah, and I think that also we have to understand the Korean peninsula is a small peninsula and it's packed tight with bases. And all of these bases have air surveillance and hair trigger
Yeah.
mechanisms for shooting anything down. And there's no way that you can move large amounts of troops or send helicopters over the capital without everything being communicated and coordinated. And so for the US to say that it didn't know is highly, highly suspect. But I think just going back to the original question, why did Yoon do this? I think a lot of people are trying to say, he's a loose cannon, he's a wild card. But I really believe that he did it because he thought he could get away with it and because it was
Yeah.
very, very deliberately planned. There's evidence coming out right now that shows that this planning went back at as far back as April of this year. And certainly by September of this year, in the National Assembly members were making charges that Yoon was preparing for martial law. The day before martial law was declared, I was on a panel and I told a whole group of people, Yoon could declare martial law, and nobody seemed to take that very seriously. But I think that it's a little bit of a misnomer when the mainstream media tries to frame this as something coming out of the blue. We saw this train approaching for quite a while. I think the important thing for us to do here is to point out, the impeachment the impeachment failed, and this was due to the collaboration of the PPP, the ruling party, with Yoon. But I think that Yoon actually could have gotten away with this. He hacked the system, and there was a way in which, essentially, if he had succeeded in preventing legislators from entering the National Assembly building, it would have been fait accompli. The game would have been over. And we know that the second day they had plans for large troop movements, essentially to take over the capital. They had plans, even that night, they had sent special forces to take over the election committees, and they sent them with ambulances and empty trucks. It's clearly preparing for bloodshed. And then, of course, we know that they sent out the intelligence forces to apprehend 14 opposition party leaders, as well as the head of the PPP himself. So this was meticulously planned. And it's only because there was some mishaps and some, I think, minimal compliance by troops that it didn't go as planned. And I think that probably has to do with the fact that Yoon himself is not a general. He doesn't come from the military, and all the people who have declared martial law have been generals. But Yoon himself is a draft dodger, so he probably didn't have full buy-in with the military. I think that was part of the problem.
And I would add just one thing there, that the closeness of the U.S. military is such that at every level of the Korean military, there is a U.S. liaison and a Korean liaison, every single level, and that includes the special forces, who are actually somewhat autonomous of the central of the command of the Korean U.S. command. But any movement, as I found when I wrote about Gwangju, the U.S. openly said we had no knowledge of special forces movements, but I found in documentation that of course they did. And they were informed of they're where they were going and everything. And so, and it's true in intelligence too. They have every level. There's a U.S. Korean liaison, and usually the Koreans take their orders from the U.S. side. But that's the fact. And so it's really impossible to think that there was no knowledge of this whatsoever. And I think at some point, whenever we get the documents, we're going to find that that's true.
Tim, I was in the ROK military, and I agree with you 100%. The South Korean military is essentially an appendage of the U.S. military. It was created by the U.S. military. Its force structure, command structure belongs to the U.S. Its equipment is American or American compatible. Its culture is American. And here's where I would disagree with you slightly, is that the special forces are, quote unquote, supposed to be autonomous because the U.S. wants plausible deniability because it's sending these special forces across the DMZ. But in terms of actual integration, the special warfare forces are the most tightly integrated with the U.S. Command. In fact, in times of war, they simply unify into a single unit.
Yeah, Tim, I just wanted to situate the events of last week within the geopolitical landscape. Right after he declared and then lifted martial law, there were protests that erupted in several different cities in front of the South Korean consulate by Korean diaspora activists. And I went to the one in New York City, and one of the speakers at this event said something like, the United States doesn't have friends. The United States has assets. And that's all Yoon Suk-yeol has been. And I think that's a very apt quote, right? The Biden administration considers Yoon a considerable asset, especially in the way that he's brought South Korea into this trilateral alliance with Japan to contain China, right? Maybe just a couple days after this martial law order was declared, the New York Times ran this piece, and I know you've seen it. It has its headline is "South Korea's turmoil is the latest threat to a three-way Pacific alliance." There's the screenshot.
There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the US has been pushing for South Korea and Japan to enter into this security agreement, and Yoon has been willing to do it. And this security agreement, it's very unpopular among South Koreans, obviously, because they don't want this alliance with their former colonizer. So to pave the way for this military, yeah, they're the three leaders meeting in Camp David last year. Yeah. So, to pave the way for this military bloc, Yoon has excused Japan from paying reparations for its war crimes that it's committed against Korea. And, understandably, this has been really unpopular with the South Korean people. But South Korea is a strategic ally of the US, and Yoon in particular has been instrumental to this so-called Indo-Pacific strategy to contain China. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit more on Yoon's role within this strategy and the geopolitical implications of, last week's events.
Okay. Well, it's important to remember this trilateral alliance has been in the works for the U.S. for years and years. First they wanted to kind of remilitarize Japan, and then, of course, South Korea was already militarized. But the U.S. has been driving this policy since, under very strong U.S. pressure. South Korea under Park Chung-hee normalized relations with South Korea, normalized relations with Japan, which basically exonerated Japan for all its past misdeeds and war crimes. But that was designed at the time because the U.S. was bogged down in Vietnam, and they needed Japan to provide more economic assistance to South Korea, as the U.S. was diverting everything to Vietnam and the whole Pacific region. And they've been working on this alliance and working on making Japan a more deeply militaristic country. And what happened was, like in 2015, under Obama, Tony Blinken, who was Obama's deputy national security advisor at the time, brokered an agreement between the right wing in Japan and Park Geun-hye, the former impeached, disgraced president of South Korea, an agreement about the so-called comfort women who were kidnapped and forced into sex slavery. And that was to be that they were hoping that would pave the way for this, military alliance. But Moon Jae-in and with the Korean people behind him, when he was elected, they rejected this treaty because, for one thing, it offered no justice, and none of the women were consulted or anything. And so that completely collapsed. And so what they were waiting for was this pro-Japanese guy to come into power. And Yoon was their perfect guy because he's his father was educated in Japan, and he has all these ties with Japan. And and he was willing to make this ridiculous agreement where, in terms of reparations, Japan pays nothing, and all the costs are borne by South Korea, which is not exactly how reparations, should work. But the other thing was, Japan, just before this agreement with Korea on the war crimes, Japan, passed laws so its troops, self-defense forces, as they're called, could attack enemy bases. This was a huge shift for Japanese, military policy, that they can actually, strike a base, say, in North Korea or China or wherever, Taiwan, anything around the region. And, if people might remember, when Biden was sort of, being told that he shouldn't run anymore, he was giving all these speeches about why he was so important. And he was telling American people, like, look, I'm the guy that got Japan to militarize, as if this is some big, important issue for Americans or anybody, so they really wanted this to happen. And so, that came together. Japan was willing to do that. And Koreans interpret this as, this means that Japan could be involved in a war in Korea. So, a lot of Americans are not aware of the terrible colonial, regime that Japan had. And, Korea did not exist as a country from 1910 to 1945. It was completely subsumed into the Japanese Empire, and all Japan also recruited all these Koreans to join their military and suppress the independence movement and oppress independence fighters in the 30s and during World War II. And those military officers that were trained by the Japanese became the core of the army that the U.S. set up in Korea in 1945 to 1948. Pak Chung-hee, he was trained by the Japanese Imperial Army. And so there's these, long history of Japan and alliances with the Japanese right and the Korean right going back a century basically. And the U.S., that's the Koreans that the U.S. has always chosen to work with, is these pro-Japanese, in some cases military, but definitely rightist authoritarian leaders. And so really, this I mean, Biden and his people are totally paranoid of losing, this trilateral alliance, because it's their strategy to go after, to encircle China, and if there's a war on Taiwan, now the commands in U.S. command and U.S. command in Korea are linked. And this is also a development that hardly anyone's reported in the U.S. And so that's what they're planning. And I think Korea, there's a lot of resistance in Korea to this, even among the ruling circles. They're not, a lot of businesses have extensive ties with China, and they don't really want to have a war with China. A lot of people in Korea. And Japan is divided too. People in Okinawa, where the U.S. Is occupied with its military bases since 1945, they're just getting sucked into it too. So it's a really, really dangerous policy.
Absolutely, Tim. It's very, very dangerous. And I agree with you. Nobody in Korea, at least nobody on the ground in Korea, wants war. But I think you're absolutely correct. In some, kind of essential sense, the patriots went north and the collaborators went south, or literally the patriots in the south were all literally killed off. We know that during the Border League massacres. But we know that Japan has wanted to remilitarize for a very, very long time, at least since 1955, since the LDP came into power. They have wanted to reestablish themselves as, quote unquote, a military power. And more recently, they have had, this notion that they're going to become a normal nation. Which means, yes, in other words, a militaristic nation. But South Korea has always been the tip of the spear with which to attack China. Korea has been, and that's been the case for at least 600 years. Every time Japan has attacked China, it has always happened.
Going right through Korea. Yep.
Right through Korea. That's like the on-ramp, right? And so the U.S. has literally forced Korea and Japan to create a military alliance. And from the standpoint of the Koreans, this is like being forced to marry your rapist. I mean, it's unthinkable. But I think this was one of the reasons why Yoon Suk-yeol was so unpopular, is he simply steamrolled a Korean popular, sentiment. I mean, literally, this is a crime against history, if you will. But if we understand that the United States has operational control over South Korea's 500,000 military, at the drop of a hat, the moment the U.S. declares DEFCON 3, it gets total control over all of South Korea's military, including all of its weapons and bases. Plus, there are another 3.1 million reserve troops, highly capable, that could also be immediately inducted. That's a huge military manpower that the U.S. has at its disposal, and it's a tremendous force multiplier for the U.S., but it's also a tremendous moral hazard. It's essentially what makes U.S. war in the Pacific most likely. And all these agreements that have been inked out over the past few years have made it very clear that Korea and Japan are going to be the U.S. proxies anywhere that the US goes to war over the Pacific, including in Taiwan, including in the South China Sea. Japan has a tremendous military, I think it's the fourth most powerful military, soon to be the third largest military budget, with one of the most powerful navies. And all of that
Yeah.
force projection capacity essentially becomes, U.S. at U.S. disposal the moment the U.S. decides to use it. So this is a very, very dangerous situation. And I think that one of the reasons why the US was so reluctant to criticize Yoon's declaration of martial law, i.e., Yoon's declaration of a military dictatorship, is that they see this alliance and they see Korea's utility as a force multiplier to be essential for them. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that, you know, South Korea under Park Chung-hee sent 300,000 soldiers to Vietnam to fight alongside the U.S., and they were deployed mostly in the sort of midsection of the country where guerrilla warfare was at its height, and Korean forces were participated in all these search and destroy missions that the U.S. had been doing for a few years, and they committed all kinds of war crimes in Vietnam, and it was it was kept from the Korean people. I mean, dead Korean soldiers would be flown back to Osan Air Base, the U.S. Air Force base, where they'd be secretly unloaded, and the families would be informed later, and they would be given some kind of compensation for their son's loss. But that's what they did, and a lot of Korean soldiers fought there, and they realized, like, when I've covered the Gwangju uprising, I found out that a lot of the people that took up arms against the South Korean army in Gwangju had fought in Vietnam, and they knew, that's how they knew, how to fight, with automatic weapons and the same kind of weapons the U.S. had, because they had participated. But they're like, oh, wait, we went to Vietnam supposedly to fight democracy, and here's our own generals, making us into a military dictatorship. And so they fought them, and so this kind of has a backfire effect. But that's exactly right, and I think that we also have to remember the bases. I mean, the U.S. bases in Japan and Korea are linked. In fact, many of the U.S. bases in Japan and Okinawa I stress because that's where 70% of the U.S. military is in Japan, major bases, they fly the UN flag. Why do they fly the UN flag? Because they're part of the UN command that U.S. ran during the Korean War. And these were the rear bases for the U.S. war in Korea. And you can see a lot of American movies made about the Korean War. It's all about American flyers living the plush life in Japan, and they go to geisha clubs and all this, and then in the day they get up and fly and over and bomb Korea, right? And so a lot of Americans don't realize, the war was fought from Japan. I mean, we had soldiers in Korea, of course, but a lot of the air war was fought from Japan, and that actually triggered, a big anti-war movement inside Japan. But I mean, so everyone in the Pentagon, all these generals, the thing is, to get promoted in the U.S. Army, you got to serve, on the front lines in Korea for a while, right? Every single head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has, gone all through that. And so they know this history, and they know that, South Koreans fought alongside the U.S. in Vietnam, and they expect that, today. So I think we're coming for not only an explosion about Koreans rejecting this whole plan, but I think a lot of people in Japan are sick of it too. And I think that Japan is far more conservative in that sense than Koreans are. But people do not want they still don't want to have their peace constitution eroded and ended. And I think that it's going to start to be a problem there as well. But I think this is the key issue in Korea is besides the dictatorial manner in which Yoon has tried to run the country, these military alliances that will put Koreans at risk and put South Korea itself at risk, and being involved in this American war.
Mm. Well, of this
Yeah.
military alliance, it sounds like Biden has found his strategic ally in Yoon in this great power competition with China. And, Yoon, as we've said, has always been massively unpopular. But Biden has always hailed South Korea and Yoon's regime as a model democracy, right? And the coup attempt last week kind of exposes that charade. But over the course of Yoon's term over the last couple of years, the US has expanded its presence in Northeast Asia and engaged in these like nearly constant military exercises
War
in the
games,
region.
right?
Yeah, war games. These war games that may have been done on a more ad hoc basis, they're now like formally institutionalized. And Yoon has been so aggressively hawkish toward North Korea during his term that he, has forced them to abandon their longstanding policy of peaceful reunification. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on. I'm seeing a lot of analysts say that this U.S.-led security cooperation supposedly seeks to deter North Korea. That's what they're saying. But a lot of analysts are saying that the real aim is to establish a regional anti-China bloc. So in that, like maintaining this state of controlled tension and conflict in the Korean Peninsula, that the purpose of that is to serve as a pretext for U.S. military activity on the Korean Peninsula in order to contain China. So ostensibly, the boogeyman that they raise is North Korea, but North Korea doesn't present quite the threat that China does, and that all this is to contain the even bigger enemy, which is China. So I was
China.
just wondering your thoughts on that.
Before you answer, Tim, I would just like to, emphasize that anytime the US uses the word deter, that's really a euphemism for provoke. And the US has always used North Korea as a pretext for
Right.
escalation against China. But I think what we have to note is that the US really is looking, in my opinion, to trigger war with China. North Korea is the easiest place to trigger war because, as I said, it has 3.1 million troops, actually 3.6 million troops at
Mhm.
ready disposal. And we know from the information that has just recently come out that the Ministry of Defense actually launched a drone into North Korea just a few days before the martial law was declared. And he had sent orders to South Korean troops to fire into North Korea. And so, I mean, clearly, sometimes people look at the martial law declaration, they think it was a little bit threadbare. But my thinking is that they had originally wanted to trigger some kind of incident with North Korea and then graft that onto the martial law declaration. And then that would have made it much, much, much more substantial.
Right, and like I've noted, um, you know, I don't think there's any more surveillance net stronger than the one the U.S. has over Korea, right? I mean, the DMZ, but there's satellites, spy planes are continually flying overhead from Okinawa. Very, very sophisticated intelligence gathering machines, basically. And they know every movement that goes across the DMZ. I mean, the U.S.'s job is to control movement across the DMZ. And so if any drone flew north, they would know about it instantaneously, And if it was a wayward drone, they would, try to figure out what was happening. But none of that apparently happened. Like, so what were these, U.S. operatives doing when they saw this happen? But getting back to the question, there's been a lot of news lately about North Korea's military alliance with Russia and the fact that they have these 10,000 troops just in Russia outside of the Ukraine border. And if you look at the timing of the U.S. Japan Korea military alliance, which Biden announced in the summer of 2023, Kim Jong-un looked at that and said to himself, and he actually wrote about this is the end of any chance of a unified Korea, because the southern part of Korea has now allied with Japan, our former colonizer. And under U.S. control. That's where they're throwing all their eggs into their basket. So why should we try for unification when that's what they've done? And so he wrote this speech, which is actually quite interesting to read, saying, North Korea and South Korea are now sovereign countries separate from each other. And people might remember they actually blew up some of the railroad and road links between North and South Korea, a couple of weeks ago. But it was only after this alliance was formally announced by Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and all these other people that Kim, went to Russia and went to met Putin in the Pacific part of Russia, and they visited an airplane, a bomber factory, and stuff like that. And then months later, he created this. He signed this military alliance with Russia. And, of course, they were allied with Russia and the Soviet Union, for a long, long time ago. But the fact is, it's the U.S. Japan Korea alliance that preceded this. And so, like, the only part of Kim Jong-un's speech that the U.S. reported was Kim said, we don't think that Korea can be unified peacefully, which was the official line of both the South Korean and the North and South Korean governments since 1972. They both had it in their constitution. And it was only, after this that Kim decided that, that's not going to happen. And so I think that, there's been so much misreporting about this, not to mention the fact that there are no North Korean troops in Ukraine, but the press keeps saying they're in Ukraine, which they're not. And in the past, I think they have, and under international law, North Korea has a perfect right to have a military alliance with Russia and help them militarily if they're one country is under threat from the other from another country. So I mean that in itself is not so surprising. But it's being used to say, oh look, see, they're just allying with Russia and it's making it even worse. So therefore we have to have this big alliance, and they don't really, and they're trying to make it look like there's these big differences between China and North Korea, which I don't really think there are. And I think China does not want to see North Korea disappeared like a lot of people in the U.S. would. And so it's really a kind of complex international situation. But I think the deterrence is focused, as you're right, it's focused not on North Korea, but on China. And it's important, like Koreans know that U.S. forces don't give, are not there to defend it against North Korea. They've known this for years. I mean, I remember visiting this town where there used to be a huge base called Camp Casey, U.S. Army base, where the 2nd Infantry was, right on the border, right? And in 1983, almost with no notice, the U.S. pulled like 2/3 of those troops out to go to Iraq. And all this time, the Koreans are told, "Oh, American troops are here to defend us," right? And then they see all these troops fly to Iraq. Like, obviously, that's not true. And so I think the U.S. credibility has been really low in Korea for years in terms of what this military is. That doesn't mean that people want to be invaded by North Korea or anything. It just means that people don't want a war.
Absolutely. And, on that note, remember South Korea, as you pointed out, sent, 340,000 troops to Vietnam. How do you square that with this threat of imminent invasion from North Korea? You can't. But
You can't.
Tim, I wanted to circle back to this notion of South Korea as being a kind of a model democracy. This is the kind of language that we've been hearing in the mainstream press. It's a model democracy, it's robust and resilient, and that it
Yeah.
was able to, right the ship of state immediately because South Korean democracy worked. Now,
Right.
for the Korean people, probably the most terrifying phrase in the Korean lexicon is Pisang Keomyang, emergency martial law decree. I mean, it triggers memories of torture, disappearance, mass graves, mass murder. And
Right.
so the Koreans, the legislators have been sleeping inside the parliament building to ensure that they don't get locked out again and they have to scramble and claw their way in. We have protesters outside the National Assembly building demanding impeachment, but also they're there to blockade and tackle martial law troops if they come out again, because Yoon is still president. He still is the
Still
commander in
president.
chief of
That's right.
of of South Korea and of the military, and he could very easily declare a second martial law decree. But this is the mythology that we've been sold, that South Korea is one of the strongest, most dynamic democracies in the world. It's a champion of democracy for the world. Yoon was touted as the leader of a pivot state that is fighting for democracy around the world. And so we see all this, kind of hypocrisy, which just becomes so apparent. But one of the things I think which is really interesting to note, in which when it became very clear that this was a coup, that an attempt of this leading democratic leader to install a military dictatorship, the US and the Western response was, we're just waiting and seeing. We just want to see what will
Right.
happen. There was no condemnation. They
No
just kept on
condemnation.
intoning. South Korea is a very, very close ally of ours, and we're just waiting and watching. And I think we even have some footage from the State Department, where you see the State Department responding to these allegations. Essentially, do you condemn martial law? And the State Department spokesman seems to be incapable of condemning
Capable.
martial law. And he seems to be incapable of affirming that the National Assembly did the right thing in rescinding national law. He's asked multiple times, do you agree with what the National Assembly did? And he just can't bring himself to say, martial law is bad and lifting martial law is good.
The secretary has been briefed, and we're keeping him appraised of the developments, as well as monitoring closely what's happening on the ground. Let me also just mention that our alliance with the Republic of Korea is ironclad, and we're fully committed to that. And ultimately here, our hope is, and every hope and expectation is, that any political disputes will be resolved peacefully and in accordance with the rule of law.
Okay. I mean, just the grave concern and the rule of law, is it the perspective of the United States that President Yoon has been following that?
So, look, this is an incredibly fluid situation. I'm not going to jump to any immediate conclusions at this point. What I can say is that we are watching these developments with grave concern. We're staying in close, appropriate touch with our ROK counterparts, and I'm sure we'll have more to say as the situation continues to unfold. I just don't want to get ahead of that.
Well, I mean, so the rule of law. I mean, the National Assembly has voted now
Certainly
to undo this,
right,
to rescind martial law. So from the perspective of the United States, should that stand? Should the martial law be rescinded?
So, look, every country, of course, has its own rules and laws and procedures. I'm certainly no expert in South Korean law, and certainly how the South Korean legislature works and what the ins and outs are of that. But certainly, it is our hope and expectation that the laws and regulations of a particular country are abided by that particular country.
Does that include the National Assembly vote?
That would be the case as well. But again, I'm just not going to get ahead of the process here.
Just to put a fun point.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's the National Assembly vote. So basically, you think that the National Assembly voted martial law should be finished. The United States respects that decision by the National Assembly.
Sean, I'm not gonna. There is obviously a lot happening in South Korea over the course of the day. Ultimately, for us, as I said, we want to see these political disputes resolved peacefully and in accordance with the rule of law. And of course, such a vote in the legislature would be consistent with that approach. But we're continuing to remain in close touch with our ROK counterparts, and I'm sure we'll read out any conversations that may or may not take place over the coming days.
How pathetic. It really reminds me of what was happening in 79 and 1980, I mean, when Park Chung-hee, the dictator, was assassinated, the U.S. and South Korean military agreed to declare martial law across the country. I think with the exception of Jeju Island, but it was martial law. And there was all these martial law decrees that the U.S. agreed with at the time. And then when Chun Doo-hwan, started taking over, what I described in my first articles on this, when I got all the documents back in '96 about what the U.S. was doing, it was a rolling coup. He first took over the CIA, the Korean CIA. No, he first took over the Korean military by actually bringing troops from the DMZ to attack the Seoul garrison. The commanders in Korea, the commander of martial law, arrested the commander of martial law and killed many soldiers. There was a big shootout there. And then he took over the CIA, and it was very clear that he was about to take over the whole country. And students and workers poured into the streets by the millions in the spring of 1980. And the U.S. was saying, "Oh, we're so concerned. We just hope the situation holds," and so on. And then when Chun Doo-hwan, declared martial law, the U.S., it was the same kind of thing. Well, we hope the democratic position will be restored, and so on. And then when there was a shocking killing, like you see in front of you, these people just massacred, the U.S., tried to, distance itself. But what my documents showed was that long before Gwangju happened, the U.S. had secretly told Chun and the titular president of Korea that the U.S. would not oppose the use of military force to put down student and worker demonstrations and, replace the police with the military. The U.S. gave clear green light to using the military. And like I said earlier, they also knew where special forces were going, and they also knew special forces were going to Gwangju. And they officially denied this. They officially denied this in a white paper the Bush administration, Bush 1, wrote, a few years later. They had no knowledge of this, of special forces, which was a complete lie. And so then Chun took over, and there was this horrendous massacre, and thousands of people, hundreds of people were dead, thousands were in jail, and the U.S. that summer of 1980, the U.S. ambassador rushed around New York to make sure all the banks would keep lending to South Korea to keep it going, and by the end of summer of 1980. The U.S. general in charge of U.S. forces in Korea gave this anonymous interview to the AP, I think it was, and said, they would be okay with Chun taking over as president. And then it came out that it was this general saying that, and within a week or so, he had taken over the presidency. And then, of course, he threatened to kill execute Kim Dae-jung. The U.S. made this big play of, let's save Kim Dae-jung's life. But as part of the deal, they completely recognized this military regime. And the next thing that happened was Chun was the first visitor to call on President Reagan at the White House. And I was there at the White House that day. And I knew that this guy was a butcher, and that, the U.S. military had backed his takeover of Gwangju. And I was just, in shock at seeing this myself. But I saw it for myself, and I went to Korea right after that. And, Chun was so unpopular, throughout the 80s, but the U.S. pretended to support the democratic process. and made the same kind of statements you're hearing from the State Department now. And when they say ironclad alliance, it's really ironclad with it's the military relationship that's ironclad. It's not ironclad with the Korean people. They could care less about the Korean people. It's the military. And when this guy, the State Department guy, says, "Oh, we're in touch with our counterparts," the real people who should be asked these questions is the Pentagon. And they've at the Pentagon here in Washington, they've completely ducked any questions about where American forces are where, et cetera, et cetera. They said, well, U.S. forces in Korea, and I talked to one guy at the Defense Department, who's supposed to be in charge of this Indo-Pacific policy, and he said, well, no, we received no advance notice, et cetera. But I think that's all lies. And anyway, how does he know? I mean, they don't know. And at the deep levels of the Korean military, like we've been talking about, there's relationships throughout. And so, the Defense Intelligence Agency has a huge presence in South Korea, and they're in touch with all levels of the Korean intelligence, Korean military intelligence. They probably knew they were probably being informed every step of the way. And that's why the State Department statement is just so preposterous and
Yeah.
cowardly, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an easy question, right? Should martial law be rescinded or not in a democratic state? That's a simple yes, no question. And we know that Yoon was attempting to kidnap his opposition and send them to black sites to prevent the National
Right.
Assembly from voting. I mean, this is a very simple black and white question, but you see, 5 minutes of, kind of circumlocution trying to avoid answering the question, which I think it speaks, as you point out, to how deeply embedded the U.S. national security state is, and that their key interests, their quote ironclad interests, are about maintaining their geostrategic position in China, in Korea, vis-a-vis China, and they need Yoon, or they need a Yoon type clone in order
Right.
to keep pressing forward with their agenda.
Right. If it wasn't Yoon, it'd be somebody else. I mean, and then I'm sure that the military intelligence, CIA, they're working on desperately trying to find their quote unquote third force, right? Somebody who would be acceptable to the ruling party and acceptable to a segment of the Korean population. But that's not Yoon. This is exactly what they did in 1979 and 1980, because there was this huge rise, massive opposition to any more military rule. At that time, Korea had been ruled by the military for 18 years. People were sick of it. And they didn't want any more, military generals running the country. And yet, the U.S. just shrugged its shoulders basically when this guy Chun. I wrote this article when Chun took over. One of the things that Chun Doo-hwan did back in '79 was when he mentioned this action when he took over the military in December 12, 1979. This was a violation of the U.S. Korean command structure. In many armies, if a general goes and violates the command, they can be executed. I mean, that's like a serious deal for military people, right? And like so Jimmy Carter, of course, his Richard Holbrooke and whoever was at the State Department drafted it for him, wrote this tough letter to the Korean president at the time, who had no power, saying, don't do this again. And then, behind the scenes, they said, please don't let this happen again. But they just dusted it, put it under the rug, and they just said, well, just don't do it again, okay? And by that time, it was too late, and Chun was in charge, and that's what they'll do now. I mean, this goes back so long. I mean, Syngman Rhee, the U.S. tried to have a coup d'état against him like twice. Even during the Korean War, they tried that, And I mean, they all knew Chun Doo-hwan was just a bloody murderer, but they still pretended that he was some kind of democratically chosen president once he was elected again. And the way the process took place, the National Assembly voted, but at the time it was 2/3 controlled by Chun. He appointed these people, so they just kind of go along with whatever looks good in paper over all the differences. But I think this gets down to the essential issue, which is we as Americans, I think, should be protesting at the White House and the State Department. I think it's great for Koreans to picket or protest at the South Korean consulates because it's their country, that they're the representative of their country. But we need to focus, on the Americans who are pulling the strings there, and the Americans who have so much power there and are willing to look aside at this kind of desperate military coup attempt, in the name of keeping our alliance together. Biden right there, he's the problem. And whoever his people are.
Well, I wanted to ask you one thing. Of these alliances, let's talk about the incoming Trump administration. Trump is definitely not any less not any less anti-war or anti-China than Biden himself, but he is a little bit more unpredictable, a little bit mercurial. During his first term, he met with Kim Jong-un, and he also demanded that South Korea pay for hosting U.S. troops on their soil, right? And some people in Washington are a little bit concerned about this three-way alliance between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea in this upcoming term, upcoming Trump administration, right? So I guess I'm curious about, what your predictions are when Trump comes in, when he assumes office, and what that means for South Korea, U.S., and Japan, that relationship, and what that means for their containment strategy of China.
I think, clearly his stance toward China is very dangerous, just as dangerous as Biden's, and could be even more so, in some ways. But and so that for that reason, he will support, the U.S. South Korean military alliance. Of course, he's going to want them to pay more, which is not a popular thing in Korea because they know troops are not there for Korea; they're there for the United States, and the same goes for Japan. And there's a possibility, that he could go back and try to reopen, talks with Kim Jong Un. The reason the last one's collapsed was I think, in my opinion, talking to Kim Jong Un and starting negotiations was like one of the only good things he did in his entire presidency. And it was completely denounced by the liberal class. I mean, it was astonishing, to see the vehemence of the attacks on Trump for doing this by all these Democrats and, Rachel Maddow and the media and MSNBC. How can we possibly have American flag and Korean flag at the same level? This is a crime, et cetera, et cetera. But he had a chance to make a really good deal, which was Kim was going to give up 80% of his nuclear capacity in return for a lifting of the most recent U.S. and UN sanctions. And it seemed like quite a reasonable deal, to a lot of people that were watching the situation. But Trump, left the table, and Bolton, who was his national security advisor, thought that would, completely betray the United States interest, and advised them, not to sign it. And so they pulled out. And so it's ever since then, the North Koreans have thought, until the U.S. doesn't treat us as like an enemy country and was willing to make peace, we're not going to talk to them. So I don't know how likely it is that Kim would join in with talks, but he might. But to me, the problem is Trump is so dismissive and arrogant toward the South Koreans that I think South Koreans who would like to have a peace deal negotiated with North Korea, between the U.S. and North Korea. I mean, everyone knows that unless this war between the U.S. and North Korea ends, there's no possibility for moving toward South-North peace in the Korean Peninsula. I mean, that was the reason Moon Jae-in got into these. I mean, he knew that was the main conflict was between the U.S. and North Korea. But like we were saying before, the U.S. likes to have North Korea there as this threat because it can justify all our military spending and all our military forces there. But I think there's a slim possibility that he could do that. But what would happen here in the think tanks and the Washington establishment, they would just condemn him for doing this again. You're what's the word that Kamala Harris kept using? I don't mess around. I don't hang out with dictators or something like that. I mean, diplomacy was created not to just hang out and be friends. Diplomacy was created to avoid and stop wars and end conflict. That's why there's peace agreements, right? You talk with your enemy. You talk to people, and I think the whole U.S. establishment, liberal mostly, does not want to have any kind of peace with North Korea because they just see it as an evil regime that has no right to an existence at all. And so I think that's the danger is he might try it, but I mean maybe he would get support in Congress. Who knows? But I think that he's going to stay with his anti-China policy, and a lot of his people are, really, just girding for war. And I think unseen to many of us, unless you read, the military press, I mean, the U.S. is planning a war. I mean, his generals are saying, we're going to be fighting a war with China in 2 years and things like that. And, the U.S. Marines just appointed a new Marine general in charge of Marines in Okinawa, and he's in charge of Marines all over the Pacific. So, it's set up for a war over Taiwan and over China. And I don't exactly know how they're going to confront China, aside from Taiwan, but it just seems a really dangerous situation. But who knows? Trump is clearly not, in the regular, pockets of the military-industrial complex as much as Biden is, and he has, he's appointing these kind of strange people to head up these intelligence and defense establishment, but they don't go along with the basic policies and principles, and so it's really, I mean, plus there's always a danger that he could use our U.S. military troops inside the United States, to suppress domestic dissent, which is scary. To me, as it would be to any, looks like it is in Korea. But I don't know. I have, libertarian contacts who think that this attempted coup, might give Trump an opening to talk with North Korea. I just don't want him to, diminish, South Korea's role in terms of trying to make peace with the North. I mean, and it's also important to remember that during the talks with Kim Jong-un, South Korea and North Korea were trying to move ahead on projects to join their railroads and other things, and that was completely blocked by the U.S., by Trump, because the U.S. controls all movement across the DMZ.
The U.S. will never allow that to happen. There was a concrete plan to join two railroads going along the side of Korea. It's kind of like a double spine that would go up from South Korea into North Korea and then all the way into Russia, and then it would join the Belt and Road. And that's something that the U.S. will never let happen.
Never happen.
Because if that happens, South Korea becomes an economic powerhouse. It blocks Japan, and it essentially creates an entire Asian Pacific bloc that is much, much more powerful than Europe or the United States. So they need to keep that from happening.
Right.
Yeah. But, I think that, regardless of who is president, Trump or Biden or Harris, I think the deep state agenda is for war, as you pointed out. Dates have been calendared 2025, 2027, the Minahan window. And South Korea is critical in this escalation because, as we pointed out, this is where the US gets to confront China. In fact, it's where the US has confronted China before
And before,
in
right?
1950. Literally, they went to war, and this is the most easy place where they have millions of troops at their disposal. And of course, we know that, as we escalate to war, we can see three hallmarks. One is escalation of information war, demonization, manufacture of consent. We also see the preparing of the theater, that is, logistical planning, military exercises. Korea's done 200 days of military exercises with the US last year, and it's actually rehearsing nuclear attacks. So strategic bombing runs. I think something like 20 strategic bombing runs were rehearsed last year, which answers the other question: how do they think they can get away with it? By using nuclear force along with the third offset. And then the third hallmark that we know that we're getting very close to war is this constant provocation, this constant provocations to engender some kind of response that then can be used to escalate to full scale kinetic war. And I think it's inside that context in which Yoon's coup or coup attempt is so important, because they absolutely need to keep Yoon or somebody like Yoon in power so that they can keep their forward momentum and the preparation for war going. So I think we're at this, kind of extraordinary moment. It's only a stroke of luck that this coup attempt was derailed. Delayed helicopters and a lot of angry citizens, jumping out of their beds and throwing their bodies against, martial law
Right.
troops. Parliamentarians, sexagenarians. These are old 60-year-old parliamentarians doing parkour and jumping over the National Assembly fences. This was kind of an extraordinary stroke of luck. But I think what we have to point out here is we're seeing not simply a constitutional crisis in Korea, but a fundamental legitimacy crisis, not simply in Korea,
Yes.
but all around the US vassal states. They're all having legitimacy crises. And so then what this gives us is it gives us an opening that the mask has fallen off, the clown show. And what we need to do is, take advantage of that and point out that, the mystification is no longer active. And therefore, it gives us an opportunity to agitate and to really strive for peace and de-escalation, as opposed to continuing down this road of, empire and escalation to war.
I agree.
Well, Tim, before we let you go, where can people find you and your work if they're interested in checking out more?
Well, I'm on both Twitter and Blue Sky. I'm trying to migrate to Blue Sky, but we'll see about that because sometimes there's a lot more interesting discussion on Twitter. But anyway, the best place is my website, which is Tim Shorrock, SHORROCK.com. And I have, a huge archive there of my work that goes back many years, including lots of documents that I obtained under the Freedom of Information Act about what happened in 1980. And I also have a Patreon site, which is it's called DMZ Empire Patreon DMZ Empire, which is what I call this empire, the DMZ Empire. I got that from the Korean poet who wrote a great book called DMZ Colony, and from a Korean perspective. And so I think it's important to understand that our empire there is based on the division of Korea. And so those are the places. But at my website, you can find me, and you can also find my Patreon. And anybody who appreciates my work and can donate there at my website.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Tim. It's been a real pleasure to have you on this show and to hear your expertise and commentary around this very, very critical issue.
Well, thank you. I have great respect for both of you, and I really like your show. And I was really, really glad to get the invitation to come on at this very crucial time. So I'm happy to come back anytime.
Yeah, we'd be happy to have you back.
And in this period of, total information warfare that we're entering, which really is about manufacturing consent for war, I think we need to do anything we can to get out the message that includes having a diversity of platforms, as many as possible, and I think being very strategic about how to use them, and also liking, subscribing, and sharing this show, the China Report on the Breakthrough News Network.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim. Hey, to end the show, as a bit of a palate cleanser, we have this video of a boy drumming during what looks like a cultural festival in China, with adults guiding him along and a crowd enthusiastically watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week on the China Report.